Hello, and welcome to the 72nd episode of Scripture in a Year, hosted by Saints Peter and Paul Orthodox Church in the Albanian Archdiocese of the OCA. Today's reading will be from the second book of the Kingdoms, or 2 Samuel, chapters 17 through 20. In those days, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose for myself 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak, and make him confused. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. I will bring all the people back to you as a bride returns to her husband, except the life of the one man whom you seek. Then all the people will be at peace." The saying pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Then Absalom said, "Call Hushai the Archite. Let us hear what he says as well." When Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom spoke to him, saying, "Ahithophel spoke in this manner. Shall we do as he says? If not, speak up." So Hushai said to Absalom, "The advice that Ahithophel gave is not good at this time." Hushai said, "You know your father and his men are very mighty and bitter in their souls, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field, or like a savage boar in the pasture. And your father is a man of war, and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in one of the hills or in some other place. And when at first some of them are overthrown, whoever hears it will say, 'There is a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like that of a lion, will melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. Therefore I advise all Israel to gather to you, from Dan to Beersheba, like the multitude of sand along the sea, with you yourself standing in the midst of them. So we will come upon him in one of the places where we may find him, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground, and we will not leave one of all the men with him. Moreover, if he withdraws into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will pull it into the river until not one small stone is left." So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord commanded we reject the good counsel of Ahithophel, if perchance the Lord might bring in all evil upon Absalom." Then Hushai the Archite said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, "Thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. Now quickly send and tell David the following: Do not remain lodged this night in Araboth of the desert wilderness. Make haste and go quickly, lest perchance one swallow up the king, and with him all the people." Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stood by the well at Rogel, awaiting a handmaid to report to them. Then they would go and tell King David, for they dared not be seen coming into and going out of the city. Nevertheless a lad saw them and told Absalom. But the two men went away quickly and came to a man's house in Bahurim. He had a reservoir for water in his court, and they went down into it. Then the woman spread a covering over the opening to the pit, and she put grain on it in need of drying to disguise what was happening. And when Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" So the woman said to them, "They passed a while ago for water." The men searched, but found no one, and returned to Jerusalem. Now after they departed, the two men came up out of the pit, and went on to tell King David. They said to David, "Arise and quickly cross over the water, for thus did Ahithophel counsel concerning you." So David and all the people with him arose and crossed over the river Jordan before morning light. Not one of them was left who did not cross over the river Jordan. Now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he arose and saddled a donkey and went to his house in the city. He gave final orders to his household, and he hanged himself and died. He was buried in his father's tomb. David went through the desert wilderness to Mahanaim, while Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Absalom appointed Amasa captain over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jethro, an Israelite who had gone in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So all Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. Now when David came to Mahanaim, he was met by Shobi, the son of Nahash, from Rabbah, the son of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, from Rogelem. They brought 10 beds and tapestries, 10 basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey and butter, sheep and cheese of the herd, and they offered them to David and the people with him to eat. For they said, "The people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the desert." David considered the people with him, and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gathite. And David said to the people, "I myself will surely go out with you as well." But they answered, "You shall not go out, for if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor will they care about us if half of us die. You are worth 10,000 of us, and now it is well that you will be more help to us in the city." Then the king said to them, "I will do whatever seems best to you." So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, "For my sake, deal gently with the young man Absalom." And the people heard the king give orders to all the captains concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the thicket against Israel, and the battle was in the thicket of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 men took place there that day. And the battle itself was scattered over the face of all the countryside, and the thicket of woods devoured more of the people that day than did the sword. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on his mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak tree, and his head caught in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule that was under him went on. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab, saying, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." So Joab said to the man who told him, "You just saw him, and did not dislodge him so he could fall to the ground? Why, I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Protect the young man Absalom for me. Do not deal with his life in a dishonorable way, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against him.'" Then Joab said, "I will make preparation for this, and thus I will not linger with you." Joab took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the grip of the oak tree. Then 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab spared the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large chasm in the thicket, into a great pit, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." He called the pillar Absalom's hand, and that is what it is called to this day. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the good news to the king, how the Lord avenged him from the hand of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You will be no messenger of good news today, for you shall take good news another day. But on this day you shall take no good news, on account of the king's son who is dead." Then Joab said to Hushai, "Go tell the king what you saw." So the Cushite bowed to Joab and left. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, let me run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "My son, why are you going to run? Come here, because you have no good news which is of use to the one going." And he said, "What if I run?" So Joab said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of Kechar, and outran Hushai. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the top of the gate of the wall and lifted his eyes and looked out. He saw a man running by himself. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, then there is good news in his mouth." And he came quickly and drew near. And the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called toward the gate and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings good news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first one resembles the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." And Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "Peace." Then he bowed to the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw a great multitude at the time of Joab sending the king's servant, and me your servant. I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what was happening." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Just then Hushai came, and he said to the king, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord avenged you today and all those who rose against you." And the king said to Hushai, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So Hushai answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man." The king was deeply troubled, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he was said as he went, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, why your death instead of mine? I instead of you. Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the deliverance of that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For that day the people heard it said, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people crept back into the city that day, like people ashamed for being cowardly in the midst of battle. The king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, "My son Absalom, Absalom, my son." And Joab came into the house before the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who delivered you today, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For today you declared that you regard neither rulers nor servants. For I perceived that if Absalom lived, and all of us had died today, then it would be well pleasing to you. Now therefore arise, go out and speak to the hearts of your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out today, not one will stay with you tonight. And that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now." Then the king arose and sat in the gate. And they told all the people, saying, "There is the king sitting in the gate." So all the people came before the king, for Israel fled, every man to his tent. Now all the people were in a dispute through all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king saved us from all of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he fled from the land and his kingdom because of Absalom. But Absalom, who he anointed over us, died in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king?" So King David sent to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the words of all Israel have come to the king? You are my brethren, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king into his house? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if you are not permanent commander of the army instead of Joab." The king swayed the hearts of all the men of Judah as that of one man, and word was sent to the king, saying, "Return, you and all your servants." And the king returned and came as far as the river Jordan. And the men of Judah came to Gilgal on their way to meet the king, to escort him across the river Jordan. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hastened and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him. And they went over the Jordan before the king. And they went through the ford, carrying the king's household, and the service of escorting the king was completed, and they did what he thought was good. Now Shimei the son of Gera fell on his face before the king as he was crossing the river Jordan. And he said to the king, "Do not let my lord impute iniquity to me, or remember the wrong your servant did on the day when my lord the king left Jerusalem, so that the king should take it to heart. For I, your servant, know that I sinned. Therefore here I am, the first to come today of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my lord the king." But Abishai the son of Zeruiah spoke up and said, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" And David said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be adversaries to me today? Shall any man be put to death today in Israel? For I do not know today whether I am king over Israel." And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die," for the king swore to him. Now Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his nails. And he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his nails or his mustache. Now Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his nails, nor mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace. So when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he answered, "My lord the king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself so I may ride on it and go to the king, because your servant is lame. And he deceived your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like an angel of God. Therefore do what is good in your eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right do I still have to cry out any more to the king?" So the king said to him, "Why are you still speaking of your affairs? I said, you and Ziba divide the land." Then Mephibosheth said to the king, "No, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come back in peace to his house." And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim and went across the river Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old, and had provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very great man. And the king said to Barzillai, "Come across with me, and I will provide for your old age in Jerusalem." But Barzillai said to the king, "How long have I to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am 80 years old today. Can I discern between the good and the bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be a further burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way across the Jordan with the king. Why should the king repay me with such a reward? Let me, your servant, remain and die in my own city, near the grave of my father and mother. But here is your servant, Chimham. He will cross over with my lord the king, and do for him what seems good to you." And the king answered, "Chimham shall come over with me, and I will do for him what seems good to you. Now I will do for you whatever you ask of me." Then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king crossed, and the king kissed Barzillai, and blessed him, and returned to his place. Now the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went with him, and all the people of Judah escorted the king, and half the people of Israel. And behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said to him, "Why did our brethren, the men of Judah, steal you away and bring the king, his household, and all David's men with him across the Jordan?" So all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "Because the king is a close relative of ours. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we ever eaten at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift?" And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, "We have 10 shares in the king. Therefore we are first over you, and we also have a greater right to David than you. Why then do you despise us? Were we not the first to advise bringing back our king?" The words of the men of Judah were sharper than the words of the men of Israel. There happened to be there a rebel whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew a trumpet and said, "We have no share in David, nor do we have inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to your tents, O Israel." So every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah from the Jordan as far as Jerusalem clung to their king. Now David entered his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and put them under guard and supported them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up to the day of their death. living in widowhood. And the king said to Amasa, "Within 3 days call the men of Judah for me, and be present here yourself." So Amasa went to call the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than the time set by David, who appointed him. And David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba the son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your lord's servants with you and pursue him so that he does not fortify cities for himself and escape from our sight." So Joab's men with the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men went after him. They went out of Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. When they reached the large stone in Gibeon, Amasa came before them. Now Joab was dressed in battle armor, and on it was a belt with a sword fastened in its sheath at his hips. Then the sword came out and fell to the ground. Then Joab said to Amasa, "Are you healthy, brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not notice the sword that was in Joab's hand, and he struck him with it in the stomach, and his entrails poured out on the ground. He did not strike him again, and he died. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri. Meanwhile, one of Joab's servants stood near him and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." But Amasa was soaked in his blood in the middle of the road. And when the man saw that all the people stood still, he removed Amasa from the path into the field. He threw a garment over him because he saw that everyone halted who came upon him. And when he was removed from the road, all the people followed after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. And he went through all the tribes of Israel to Abel and Beth-Maachah and all the Cherites. So they joined together and went after Sheba. Then they came and besieged Sheba in Abel and Beth-Maachah. And they raised a siege mound against the city and stood by the rampart. And all the people with Joab considered pulling down the wall. Then a wise woman cried out from the wall, "Listen, listen! Tell Joab to come near, and I will speak with him." When he came near to her, the woman said, "Are you Joab?" He answered, "I am." Then she said to him, "Hear the words of your handmaid." And he replied, "I am listening." So she spoke, saying, "In former times they used to say, they asked at Abel and in Dan whether the things established by the faithful of Israel failed, and they will ask in Abel whether they failed. I am among the peaceable and loyal in Israel. You seek to put a city and a capital in Israel to death. Why are you going to swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" And Joab answered and said, far be it from me to swallow it up or destroy it. That is not so. But a man from the mountains of Ephraim, Sheba, son of Bichri by name, raised his hands against King David. Deliver him only to me, and I will depart from the city." So the woman said to Joab, "Watch, his head will be thrown to you over the wall." Then the woman in her wisdom went to the people and spoke to all the city, and they cut off the head of Sheba the son of Bichri, and threw it out to Joab. Then he blew a trumpet, and they scattered from the city, every man to his tent. So Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem. And Joab was over all the army of Israel. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was in charge of revenue. Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was recorder. Shiva was scribe. Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jairite was a priest of David. Here ends the reading for today.